What is the current position of the United States on Ukraine, and how has it evolved in recent weeks amid shifting geopolitical dynamics?
U.S., Ukraine, are you familiar with the expression, the red-headed stepchild? So in certain U.S. culture, there was, if a family adopted a kid, they called him the red-headed stepchild. He wasn't the favorite, he wasn't part of the inner family. He's always treated as an outsider. And that's what Ukraine is now with respect to the United States, the red-headed stepchild, because the favorite son, Israel, they're getting all the love, all the money, all the weapons, and the Ukraine's getting nothing. And, what's really, there's also a lot of self-deceit between both the West and in Ukraine. Zelensky wrote this letter to Trump complaining about, we need more Patriot missiles, we need more air defense. Ukraine started getting their first batch of Patriot missiles, PAC-3s, in 2023. And so 2023, 2024, into early 2025, they received a grand total of like 950 PAC-3 missiles. Now, do the math. So if you've got an inbound Russian missile, ballistic, cruise, or even a Garand drone, you're going to have to fire 2 of those PAC-3s at that incoming missile. So just do a search on one of the AI engines and ask the question, how many missiles has Russia fired since 2023? And ballistic, cruise, I didn't even ask about drones. Numbers between 8,000 and 12,000. So do the math. If you got 950, that means you can shoot at 475 missiles. And if you do that, you've exhausted your supply of PAC-3s. And they're shooting down 90% of 12,000, 8,000 to 12,000 missiles. Please, stop lying. They don't. The point is, Ukraine has hardly had any air defense system now for more than 2 years. And, they always put a happy face on it, claiming, oh, yeah, we shot down X amount. They haven't. And the sad part of this is they can beg the United States all they want for more PAC-3 missiles. The United States produces an average of about 60 a month, okay, which means they could take out 30, potentially take out 30 missiles. Well, where's the priority? The priority with Israel or with Ukraine?
Obviously, Israel is central here. But at the same time, Ukraine seems to have drawn a similar lesson to Iran, that you may not be able to prevent incoming strikes, but you can preserve your ability to respond. What's proving effective isn't expensive systems like Patriot, but rather low-cost drones that can still inflict damage, leaving both sides in a position where they're forced to absorb ongoing strikes. And often, it's the larger power that proves more vulnerable to that pressure.
No, I disagree, for this reason. One, most of the drones that are fired into Russia are shot down. Russia still they have a very ample and effective air defense system.
Right.
A few get through, and they cause some damage, but damage on what scale? Let's remember in size comparison, and even the size comparison with Iran. Ukraine is roughly 1/3 the size of Iran, okay, in terms of landmass. And when you look at all of the 8,000 to 12,000 ballistic and cruise missiles over a 4-year period, no telling how many, I'd say easily 20 to 30,000 drones. Even with all that firepower spread out over Ukraine, it still hasn't hollowed out the society. It is reducing it by attrition. Ukraine, for its part, they don't even come close to that kind of firepower. Their only real firepower now are, they may have some storm shadows, and they've got some drones. Now they're getting a fairly significant resupply of drones from the UK, but then that makes the UK now a target based upon what Lavrov announced the other day. So it is, from the Russian standpoint, they're pursuing a military plan. It doesn't fit within any of the Western models of how we think we should do warfare, even though the West has these plans. But look how poorly they performed over the last 66 years. We don't have to look at just one case. We got multiple cases. Let's go to the Korean War. U.S. failed to defeat North Korea and China in the Korean War, failed to defeat Vietnam, and then all these other scattershot wars. We quote defeated Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War, even though looking back on it, that was a war that never should have happened because Saddam was a client of the United States. Iraq had been supported, funded, armed, equipped by the United States during its war with Iran. And then in a little over less than a year and a half, the United States turned with a vengeance on Saddam Hussein. You got to look back at that war was so unnecessary. And I looking back, I didn't realize back then what I understand today, what I know today. Because then I viewed that, I hadn't followed the history of the Iran-Iraq War. I didn't realize the United States had been supplying the chemical and biological weapons and providing the intelligence that Iraq was using to attack Iran. I just said, hey, here's this Saddam guy out of the blue attacks Kuwait. I didn't really understand that Saddam had met with the U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie and said, hey, these Kuwaitis are stealing our oil, so I'm going to go in and stop it. Do you have a problem with that? And April said to him, the U.S. has no position on that. And he said, okay. And remember, this is the guy who had been interacting with CIA and U.S. Department of Defense assets for almost 10 years. So, he thought, hey, Americans, I got a decent relationship with them. Little did he understand that he was still the redheaded stepchild. Favorite son Israel was still at the forefront and was one of the major justifications, or at least motivations, for the United States to do that attack in 1990 to drive him out of Kuwait. So this is, the United States militarily has failed. And that's the other thing, I think, the revelation for Russia out of this whole, it's one thing to do an intelligence assessment, but then it's another thing to see how it actually plays out on the battlefield. Scott Ritter and I had a brief disagreement in the summer of 2022 when they first introduced, the United States first introduced some of its 155 millimeter artillery and one of the earlier short range missiles. And Scott said at the time he thought that was a game changer, and I said, no, it's not. This doesn't alter the course. But now we're at a stage of what we're going to see the Russians do will be a game changer. It will fundamentally change the nature of the war, and it's going to because now Russia realizes the United States is effectively a paper tiger. It can cause some damage. But the United States has been unable to defeat the Houthis, and now it's been unable to defeat Iran and all of its so-called Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons supplied to Ukraine, have failed to put a dent in Russia's military and industrial capability.
The key concern is the potential endgame from Russia's perspective. If we look at past statements, like Hillary Clinton suggesting Ukraine could become Russia's Afghanistan, the strategy seems clear. Turn the conflict into a prolonged quagmire. Not necessarily a war you win outright, but one where constant low-level pressure, insurgency, drones, small-scale strikes, gradually wears down the opponent over time. We're already seeing elements of that with persistent drone attacks into Russian territory, designed as cumulative pinpricks rather than decisive blows. So the real question is, how does Russia avoid being drawn into a long war of attrition that it may dominate militarily, but still struggle to decisively end?
Well, Russia actually has a successful track record in dealing with insurgencies, Western-backed insurgencies. You know, the first one was in the aftermath of World War II, going into 1949, 1950. And the CIA and MI6 were busy with Banderites putting together Ukrainian units that were to carry out attacks in Russia. It took the Russians then about 6 years to quell that. Then let's jump ahead to the 1990s. You had the first Chechen War, 92, 93. But then the second one, that was begun in earnest in August, I think the date was August 9th of 1999. And that went on for about 11 years. It ended in 2010 when Medvedev was president. So Russia has successfully fought insurgencies, Western-backed insurgencies, and defeated them. And the defeat in the Second Chechen War was it a brutal war? Oh, absolutely. You know, the Russians killed a lot of people. But when it was all over, they had the loyalty of the Muslim population in Chechnya. And I can testify to that just based on my conversations with General Abdialudinov. You know, he's a hero of Russia, but he's a devout Muslim. And he was involved with those as a very young man, teenager, in that Second Chechen War. So Russia they're continuing this war of attrition, bleeding out Ukraine. But on top of it, I think, you know, what we're going to see is Russia will take Kiev, or Kiev, you know, however we want to pronounce it, and they will take Odessa and probably Transnistria. Before this is all over, they will militarily defeat Ukrainian forces. And if any NATO forces try to go in and defend in Odessa, they'll be wiped out. And it's going to be Russia. It'll be brutal, but that's where I see what Russia's prepared to do.
At this stage, Russia still appears intent on keeping the conflict contained within Ukraine. Ukraine, meanwhile, is pushing to broaden it, with Europe largely aligned and seeking to Europeanize the war. In the end, much may hinge on Washington's decision, whether to contain the conflict or allow it to expand further.
Yeah, Trump will not get further involved with Ukraine. I'm pretty confident of that. He's too caught in Iran. You know, the United States we've already got very limited military operations there, and he's suffering a political beating right now. His popularity, it's at the same level as Richard Nixon in his second term. And remember, Nixon in his second term was in the midst of Watergate. 63% of Americans opposed him. And that's where Trump is right now. 63, he's only got 37% saying they support Trump.
The Iran war appears to have significantly damaged Trump's MAGA base, with little sign of recovery so far. And in that context, his recent claim that he spoke with multiple West Asian leaders, including Turkey, and that they should all join a peace framework essentially tied to the Abraham Accords and recognize Israel, including countries like Pakistan, raises serious questions. Historically, neutral or non-aligned states have never been pushed into joining peace agreements in this way. Is this a realistic diplomatic strategy, or a move that actually makes any meaningful agreement even less likely?
Yeah, well, the reports are that when he brought that up, he had all these people on a conference call. And when he brought that up, there was dead silence. Nobody spoke up and said, yeah, Mr. President, that's a great idea. Yeah, well, let's do that. Is something like the Abraham Accords possible? Yes, I think under one scenario. That scenario would be Israel must grant statehood to the Palestinians. They must be secure. Israel has withdrawn its military forces back to the appropriate boundaries. And then, and only then, would these other nations be willing to entertain recognizing Israel's as a sovereign state. As long as they continue to fight the wars and attack Lebanon and attack the Palestinians, there will be no Abraham agreement. And the Saudis made that very clear. The next day, they released a statement saying, no, Not going to happen until the rights of the Palestinian people are addressed. Same thing out of Qatar and same thing out of Iran. So, you're right. It looks as if Trump's maybe tried to deliberately sabotage his own peace effort. But that's not going anywhere.
Or is he actually engaged in an internal struggle with figures like the neocons, including Lindsey Graham and Mike Pompeo, who immediately pushed back when a deal with Iran was reportedly close? And when Trump suddenly floats ideas like this, is it a way of placating that wing, or just reopening divisions inside his own camp?
Yeah, well, as you correctly note, the social media accounts with the Zionist crowd went wild.
Oh, yeah.
And that may have, and again, today we saw Trump said things that someone who is in touch with White House sources wrote and said, look, Trump has once again pulled the plug on a peace agreement by his, statements that, that Iran's not going to remain in control of the Strait of Hormuz, and that and insisting that the Abraham Accord must be upheld. So I know the Pakistanis, that they've got the lead role in this negotiations, trying to patch together an agreement. They've got the full backing of China, and China and Russia are both involved in diplomatic pressure on the Gulf Arabs. Now, if we're coming on air, I got a report from somebody who is involved with the negotiations from the Chinese side, and they report that Qatar has now informed the United States, basically, you got 6 to 9 months, get the hell out of Qatar, which means closing Al Udeid Air Force Base, which is the largest. It is the brain center for all U.S. military operations in West Asia. I'm actually surprised Iran didn't inflict more damage on it during the first 5 weeks of the war. And that may have been because, you remember, it's a complicated relationship between Iran and Qatar. A few years back, Qatar was isolated. It was facing attack from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And they were actually preventing, the arrival of even humanitarian supplies. Well, who supplied Qatar during that time? Iran. So the Qataris are not a bunch of ingrates. They remember that. And so this is why, in fact, Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament, was in Qatar. And I don't know who he specifically met with, but I'm sure it was with the leaders. So Iran is this whole new security architecture. They're working to put that together. And what that means is the exclusion of the United States from West Asia.
And it seems that Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar have already pushed back against U.S. positioning, while even Oman, despite its limited strategic profile, has still been pulled into the wider spillover dynamics. There are also claims that fragmented command structures on the ground may have contributed to unintended strikes across the region. Is a broader message now taking hold in the Gulf that U.S. presence itself is part of the instability? And is that shifting the direction of negotiations on the ground?
It's not an overnight process, and there's still the Pakistanis are working at the direction of the Chinese. Want to ensure that they get this new security architecture in place, that basically it will be the Gulf states and Iran guaranteeing their own security as a group.
Yeah.
And so the one problem child in this whole lash-up is United Arab Emirates. Yeah. And even within the Emiratis, it's not all of the emirs. It's basically the guy, MBZ, who I believe is in, what is the other? It's not Dubai, the other main city in
Abu Dhabi.
UAE, Abu Dhabi. Yeah, I think that's his main, where he hangs his hat. So, This is a work in progress. But as we came on air, I see that there were new clashes tonight over Bandar Abbas. So this may still get back into a heated exchange. It looks like Foreign Minister Arachi traveled to Moscow yesterday. Kremlin hasn't highlighted. I'm assuming it was Arachi. It may have been the Minister of Defense. The Russians so far haven't issued any readout on that kind of meeting. So, and I'm sure it's negotiations and talks about what could Iran be suggesting. Iran said, okay, look, we'll give up the enriched uranium provided that Russia store it. There's also talk that Pakistan would store it. And then Trump is saying, no, that couldn't happen. But, for Iran, it's a red line. The United States is not going to tell Iran what it can do with its enriched uranium. Iran will make that decision.